Hello and welcome to the Deindustrialization and Politics of Our Time podcast. My name is Gabriel Ellison-Scowcroft, and I'm pursuing a master's in history at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, also known as Shokshoge by the custodians of this land, the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. Today, Marion Henry is here to talk about her recent article, Des coulisses à la scène, la féminisation des brass bands dans les bassins miniers britanniques 1947 à 1984. In English, From the Wings to the Stage, The Feminization of Brass Bands in British Mining Basins 1947 to 1984, published in Le Mouvement Social from Sciences Po Press. So before we get into the article, can you introduce yourself, Marion, and say where you're coming from?
So thanks first very much for inviting me to the DePOT podcast. I'm very happy to having this discussion with you today and to discuss a bit about my research. So my name is Marion Henry. I'm French. I've just recently graduated from a PhD in history at Sciences Po in Paris, and at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, so that was a joint degree. And the thesis focuses on mining brass bands in Britain between 1947 and 1984. So I've lived in Paris for about 10 years now, and I spent 2 years in Glasgow for my research because I was doing field work in Britain. And originally I come from Brittany, which is a region in the northwest of France, and from a town called Lorient in the south of Brittany.
Well, thank you. So, just a quick clarification: is your PhD thesis the same title as this article? And what relation does this article have to your sort of, or like, is this a condensed version? Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So the article is a condensed version focused on one theme specifically, which is the gender question, which is one of the big questions of the thesis, and the question of gender relations in brass bands. So both the question of masculinities, working class masculinities through brass bands as a space of sociability. But the whole thesis is on the evolution of mining brass bands between the 40s and the 80s, and more particularly on how brass bands were used to create and recreate communities in Britain in the kind of double context of changing popular culture with the progressive competition of jazz music and rock music, which is a challenge for brass bands, and also deindustrialization. So I'm trying to analyze the evolution of brass bands in that context, and then the gender aspect is one of the aspects of the thesis.
Okay, thanks for that. And can you say a bit more about the period of time that you've chosen to analyze and why you chose this period?
Yeah, sure. So 1947 was a good starting point for me because it's the year the coal industry was nationalized in Britain. So it's interesting both socially and politically, because in the context of rebuilding Britain after World War II, coal was really a crucial question to rebuild the country, and it was deemed important to have this nationalization to modernize the infrastructure and for productivity. And it also has interesting sources from that period as well. For instance, the magazine Coal, which was an official magazine that was published by the National Coal Board, that was the new institution managing the coal industry when it became owning by the state. And so this magazine is an interesting source because there's loads of articles about social and cultural activities in the coal fields, and especially brass bands. And then 1984, because it's the start of the miners' strike, the Great Miners' Strike of 1984-1985. And I chose to stop before the strike because it's usually pointed out by historians as a very important shift in terms of acceleration of the industrialization from that period until the 1990s. And also the strike has been very much analyzed in itself by historians already. So I wanted to shift the focus a bit away from main strikes and conflicts that have been well analyzed in mining studies, and more focusing on the kind of long-term aspect. So that's why I chose this period.
But before we talk a little bit more about the history of brass bands and the kind of role that they occupy in this work, and also in the role that they occupied in these communities, can you say also a little bit about how you became interested in this, and sort of what your process has been in terms of finding out about this and then wanting to look into it more?
Yeah. So I did an undergraduate studies in Rennes in Brittany, and it was a kind of multidisciplinary program, and I came to be very interested in both history and in English, and I didn't really know how to choose, and finally started a master's in history at Sciences Po in Paris. So I knew I wanted to work on British modern history, and especially on British labour and working class history, because I studied working class history during my undergrad, and also because probably I watched loads of Ken Loach movies, and I was very very interested in that aspect. So that was my first kind of center of interest, and then I was also very interested in cultural history and cultural activities, and especially music, probably because I've always enjoyed listening to music, and also I played music when I was at school. I played the Celtic harp when I was at school, which is a very Brittany things to do. So Celtic music, and then I also sang in a choir, and so. Yeah, I really was interested in popular music and popular music studies, and I thought that popular music was a good point of entry into analyzing societies, past societies, and that it wasn't necessarily always used by historians to analyze past societies. And then the idea to kind of mix working class history and music was really with the influence of Marion Fontaine's work, who's also a historian at DePOT, and who's worked on football in French coal fields. And she wrote a book on the Lens Racing Club, so a football club in the north of France, which is a long-term history with the French coal mining industry. So that's really when I thought that studying leisure activities were very interesting and important to understand the history of working class communities. So that was really the inspiration. And then when I started to analyze and find sources on musical activities in the coal fields, I found that brass bands stood out because first, sources were available, because brass bands is quite a costly activities compared to maybe singing in a choir, because bands needed to pay for the instruments, both buying and reconditioning the instruments and the uniforms as well. So there were institutional sources showing the evidence of grants given to brass bands to buy instruments. And also because it's an important symbol of British working class culture that I wanted to deconstruct, and it's a working class musical activity that's perceived as traditional that could be found in the whole of Britain. Because, for example, other activities like choirs or pipe bands in Scotland, even though they could also be found in other areas, are more related to a specific area. So choirs to the South Wales coalfields and pipe bands to Scotland. So I thought I wanted to have a national framework, and I thought that brass bands was interesting for that.
So what is the history of brass bands in coal mining communities specifically?
Yeah, brass bands have a very, very rooted history in British working class areas, and they really became a kind of symbol of British working class culture. If you think about the movie Brass Stuff, for instance, that came out in 1996 by Mark Ehrman, that was a very, very big success in the UK, which shows the importance of this musical activity. So they are amateur musical formations, and they are composed of 24 to 25 brass instruments, so only brass plus percussion. And the instrumentation really stabilized in the late 19th century with competition. And so it includes cornets, horns, baritones, trombones, and basses. And so the first brass bands emerged in the early 19th century. So it's a really 19th century phenomenon in British working class area, and especially in the north of England originally, even though afterward they spread to all parts of Britain. And from the mid-19th century, they really, really developed and became a mass working class activity. And this was especially encouraged by the invention of the piston valve first, which led to the mass production of the instruments, and which made the instruments more available to working class people. So that was a factor. And then during the Victorian period, the idea of a rational recreation, so the idea that music could be a self-improving activity for the working classes, was promoted by middle class industrialists and paternalism. And especially art music, classical music, and through brass bands, working class people could play adapted pieces of classical music. So it was thought as a way to improve working class people, and also to keep them in order. And then so the repertoire has always been very varied, because they had several functions. So 3 main functions basically: concerts and contests. So these could be both indoors or outdoors, and contest is quite a specific feature. So like football, for instance, brass bands would compete when they would play a set piece. Several bands would all play the same piece of music, and then they would be rated by an adjudicator who couldn't see the band, but who was in a box and could hear the band, and then would put a grade on the band. And there were different sections, same system as football leagues. So they would be like a top league, and then second, third. So in the brass band world, the first section is the championship section, and then there's the second section, third section, fourth section. So it's a very specific feature, and it's very important because it really contributed to shape the repertoire and to shape the practices and the culture. So that's the first function, contests and concerts. Also playing for dancing, so to make people dance. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, but this function slowly disappeared because from the interwar years especially, there was the concurrence of jazz music and dance bands who then took the leadership of making the people dance. But that was a function. And then the last function is more of a community function. So playing because brass bands are also a marching type of music. So they would play outdoors marching with a repertoire made of religious hymns, marches, military marches. So they would play for ceremonies, funerals, and then many events linked to the trade unions and to the working class movements, like demonstrations or miners' galas that were very popular in Britain, or religious events as well, like wit walks, for instance, in the north of England. So that's, and then the membership really reflected their ties with the working classes. Because it was really a working class activity, and miners especially were very, very prominent amongst brass bands. And so because it was mostly to be found amongst working class areas and especially heavy industries, women were traditionally excluded from these bands.
It struck me, and this isn't a question that we talked about beforehand, but the thing that you said just now about paternalism and the role of sort of the upper or middle classes believing that this was in part about, quote unquote, improving working class people. What relationship, if any, do you see between that kind of paternalism and the gendered nature of the participation in the breast bands?
Yeah, I think we can relate it to the question of the performance of masculinities, because there's we can come back to it as well, but in the Victorian culture of brass banding, there's it's kind of built on a negotiation between respectability and roughness. And there's always this ambivalence, and it's on the side of respectability, it can really be linked to this rational recreation ethos. So the idea was to build a man of order. Discipline was at the core of brass banding culture, and it's also linked to the military origins of brass bands music as well. So there's this affiliation to military music and military culture, which we find in the uniforms as well of old brass bands, very inspired by military attires with tunic and pit caps, even if these uniforms were abandoned progressively. So this idea of discipline, and then this idea of respectability. So the idea that when men were wearing the uniform, they were representing their community as well as the band and as well as the factory or the colliery they worked in. So they had to present themselves as respectable working man. So then we can link it to paternalism as well.
Do you want to maybe continue that thought on, or just continue this conversation into the question of the sort of the differing or similar performances of masculinity, both in the workplace and in breast bands?
Yeah, I think it really can be related to this relationship between respectability and roughness. But first, I think we can say that it can be related to this performance of masculinity first, because it was a very homosocial environment and women were traditionally excluded from brass bands. So that's a first point. We can find several reasons, but first, because the workforce was very gendered, and especially in heavy industries. Women were mostly excluded from heavy industries, such as coal mining, because from the mid-19th century they were forbidden to work underground, but they were mostly working on the surface, cleaning coal, screening coal, working in workshops, in the canteens. But this means that mining was then very, very associated with being a very masculine environment and a masculine work culture that we can also find in other industries. And then the leisure activities in the early 20th century were also very gendered, because leisure was thought as a reward for paid labor. So traditionally, outdoors leisure activities were mostly organized for men and around men, such as clubs or sports activities, pub. So that's the second point. And then in brass bands, there's also the idea that brass instruments, so wind instruments in general, but especially brass instruments were not appropriate for women, because the fact of blowing, etc., wasn't graceful for the face, so it wasn't considered appropriate for women. So women took wind instruments and brass instruments, especially later than other types of instruments, such as string instruments, for instance. And so then all the sociabilities linked to brass banding and brass banding culture were very linked to working class masculinities and to this relationship between respectability and roughness. So there are all these points I explained about respectability and discipline, but also the idea of roughness. So the idea that the working man was also a rough man or a hard man, and that brass bands, such as other types of leisure activities, could be spaces for men to swear, to fight, or to joke. And this can be visible at the workplace as well. There are several historians, for instance, who've recently worked on humour and masculinity and jokes at the workplace, using oral history, especially Ariane Mack, for instance, who wrote an article in the same issue of the journal that my article is from. All the features linked to heavy drinking and heavy smoking as well, with the idea that holding one's alcohol was perceived as a tough attitude and also reflected workers' earnings capacity. But it was still ambivalent, because men, when they were wearing their uniform, could be rough, but they need to remain respectable. And this is quite visible in relation to drinking. For instance, when I did interview with musicians, they often said that there was often a tacit rule that drinking and heavy drinking was accepted during a contest, but only after the performance. So I had several interviewees who said, for instance, they wanted to be, because there was a draw to select the order in which bands would play, because they only had a number, because the adjudicator couldn't see them. So for the draw, they wanted to be picked first, so that then they could play and go to the pub and come back for a prize ceremony, which showed that even if it's heavy drinking is part of brass band culture, there's also rules that are linked to these ethos and culture. And the importance of competition as well was very important in brass band culture, but also in working class culture in general. If we think about sports, pigeon races in the UK, or horticultural shows, and at the workplace as well, because competition was also a feature of work culture in several heavy industries, with the figure of the hard man. In the coal industry, there's the mythical figure of the big hewer, who was a miner with superhuman strength. So this can be related to this competitive aspect. And this competitive spirit was especially encouraged after World War II, in the battle for coal and the need for productivity. So yeah, there's definitely many aspects that we can relate between masculinities at play, at leisure, and at the workplace.
skipped over the question about oral history. Maybe we can come back to that in a little bit, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Maybe we could move straight from this into. I mean, one of the things that you write about is that women's labor in the context of brass bands was invisibilized or was invisible, but nonetheless, of course, it was there. And maybe can you talk about that?
Yeah. So women weren't very present in brass bands in the 1940s, but they were still starting to be part of brass bands as musicians from the interwar years. So a few women progressively joined brass bands from the interwar years, but it definitely remained a masculine activity in terms of the musicians. But then women mostly played a role behind the scenes. So that's why it's the title of the article. And they play so important role as supporters, going to contests to support bands and going to various performances with the band. And they played a very important role to support generally and fund brass bands activities through ladies committees. So often the married women, the wives of band players would organize themselves in ladies committees and would organize fundraisings to fund either purchase of instruments or uniforms, or to pay for a travel fare to go to a contest. So they organize game nights, for instance, to raise money, fairs, or they could often bake and sell goods as well to support the bands. Or if bands had contests or concerts, they could also come and bring sandwiches and tea for the band as well. So they definitely played a very, very important role behind the scenes. And this is visible both in written archives, when there's evidence of articles newspaper articles mentioning that the band got maybe several hundreds of pounds from fundraisings by the ladies' committees to buy new uniforms, for instance, or through oral interviews. Several participants also recalled that their mother, often especially, would be part of the ladies' committees and would come for contests and concerts, etc. So yeah, definitely a central role, but mostly behind the scenes at that time.
So now that you've sort of given us this outline of pre-1940s brass bands, in the piece you really outlined the 1940s as being this kind of transitional time, and I'm wondering if you can outline a little bit more about, both what was happening out in the world and what was happening sort of locally in these communities that saw the beginning of this transition into the what you call the feminization of brass bands.
Yeah, so the 1940s is really the continuation of a trend that was initiated during the interwar years, when several women progressively joined mining brass bands. And this was linked to several factors. First, in terms of change in popular culture and popular music, the success of jazz and dance bands led several women to join brass bands and to join dance bands as well. We've got the example of Gracie Cole, for instance, who was a famous musician who was very famous for playing in several dance bands during the 40s and 50s, playing the trumpet, but she started as a musician, as a cornet player in mining brass bands, in several mining brass bands, and she was from a mining family. And then we also have the from the interwar years, and especially then it was continued continued in the 40s and in the 50s the development of training section for young players. So the musical education of young players of school age often was really encouraged from that point. And this also allowed more women, and especially young girls, to join brass bands at that time. So this really would be the main factors.
Maybe this is a good moment to bring oral history back in, and the way that you used oral history methodology, and why you thought it was important in this context.
Yeah, so oral history is a methodology that I've used for this article, but I've used it for my whole thesis as well. It's one of the main methodology and sources that I've used. So in this article, it's a selection of the interviews that I've conducted. So for this article, it's a selection of 14 interviews, 14 semi-directed interviews with 17 musicians, brass band musicians who were connected to the coal mining industry, either directly because they worked in the coal mining industry, or indirectly because they were connected to the industry through family. And the interviews were conducted in several former coal fields, the East Midlands, Yorkshire and Scotland, because these areas are quite contrasted, especially in terms of the impact of deindustrialization, because Scotland, for instance, was impacted much earlier than the East Midlands and Yorkshire by deindustrialization. So it was interesting to have these contrasted areas. And I thought that oral history was very useful and very valuable for several reasons. Because I really wanted to grasp the feminization of brass bands from below, and to analyze experiences and practices, and I wanted to confront this to other sources, because, for instance, I mentioned the magazine Coal News, published by the National Coal Board, which was aimed at being the happy face of the nationalized industry, and to say that everything was great and modern in the industry. So they would... So we can see through these articles, and especially through photographs, that women were more and more present in these bands. But it's a very normative way to present bands. So I wanted to analyze and know more about players' experiences and trajectories. And through oral history, it also gave me access to spaces and practices that were difficult to access with other sources. So what was happening in the band room, for instance, what was happening during rehearsals, during break, during smoke breaks, rehearsals, the question of musical education, because musical education was often made within the band and through family. So it was good as well to see transmission of musical practice from fathers to son, and then from fathers to daughters, or space like the band bus, for instance, which is a space where women were excluded from a long time in certain bands. They weren't allowed to go on the band bus to go to concerts and competitions, and these spaces were more accessible through oral history, in order to see the more day-to-day production and contestation of gender norms, and then to see trajectories as well, and to see trajectories of players, and especially women's players, because they were less visible in brass band literature than men player, to see the generational aspect as well. And also it was interesting to access additional documents such as personal photographs, music recordings sometimes, and I've featured a few photographs in the article that were given to me by interviewees. So I thought that these are interesting sources as well.
Just out of curiosity, did any of your interviewees know I've forgotten the name of the Cole magazine, but were any of them familiar with the magazine? And I'm curious if there were any, and if there was any interesting discussions that came out of that.
Most of them knew it because I think it was widely distributed in collieries. But yeah, most interviewees said that it was propaganda basically of the National Coal Board. So most of them weren't very interested in reading coal news because they knew it was coming from the coal board. But if their local pit was featured in coal, and because there were regular publication of tables of productivity, so they would put each pit productivity to enhance production. They could be interested to see their local pit featured in, but most of them they weren't really interested in reading coal news.
Okay, so maybe continuing to talk about, I guess, really getting into the meat of this article finally, in terms of the time period that you're looking at. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the sort of stages of feminization in brass bands, what changed, what didn't change. And maybe also, if you wouldn't mind, maybe talk a little bit about how you're employing the concept of feminization, or how you think through the idea of feminization.
Yeah, so I think it's really, in the period I'm studying, it's really two main phases, and I think the shift is really the mid late 1960s. It's when I think we see a significant change, because before the mid 1950s, 60s, it was really the continuation of that trend from the interwar years. So even though women progressively joined mining brass bands at that stage, there were usually very few of them. So there were really a minority in each band, maybe 2 or 3. And in articles, it's always presented as something a bit odd and a bit quirky, and it's just 1 or 2 or maybe 4 at most. Most of them are also very young, so it's mostly girls of school age or teenagers, which shows that the process is only starting. And most of them learned their instruments through family, and were connected to the band through their family. So most of them were the daughter of the conductor or the sister of one of the player. So it was really the organization then. But we can see a really significant change in membership of mining brass bands from the mid 1960s and then through the 1970s, 1970s, because we can see, I don't have numbers because I didn't do any quantitative analysis, it was mostly qualitative, but we can see that they are more numerous. So it's not 1 or 2, it can be up to 1/3 of the total band at that time. And this was really linked to the important development of youth bands and school bands during that time period. So it was initiated from the 40s, 50s, the training of young players, but from the 60s it really developed. And then because young players could have accessed through music at school, young girls were more and more numerous to join brass bands, which means that then the age range was wider from the 1960s. So we can see schoolgirls, teenagers, but also young women, married women, and even women who had children who were musicians in bands. Even sometimes it was difficult to combine family life with brass bandings. We can also see articles about romantic relationships in brass bands, so between band players, which also show that the trend really built up. So it's not really a rupture or a really significant change, but it's definitely an acceleration of a process that is more long term. But from the 60s, we can really find an acceleration, and I think the two main factors are first the kind of disinterest for brass band music, and deindustrialization, which meant that more spaces were available for women players, and then women were very instrumental in maintaining banding activities, and young players as well. And the educational aspect, and the fact that brass instruments were more and more taught at school, and that more and more band invested in training junior sections. So that's the two main factors. But then, as you saw in the article, I also tried to emphasize elements that didn't change, and the long-term way of gender norms on women's trajectories and experiences. In terms of the vertical segregation, especially because it was often harder for women to access most prestigious position in the brass band movement. So it could be a championship band. So for instance, I think Grimefort Colliery Band, which is one of the most famous mining brass bands that inspired the movie Brass Stuff. The first woman to join Grimefort was in the 2010s. So it's a very, very, very late, and it's kind of similar to what can happen with very prestigious classical orchestras, for instance. And I've used work by sociologists who worked on classical musical orchestras to see the presence of gender norms as well. And then top position within a band, so this would be solo players and the principal player, so it would be the main solo player, and especially the principal cornet, which was really the most prestigious seat in the brass band, was less easily accessible for women, even if more and more of them became solo players. And the most difficult probably was to be a conductor. Conducting a band still remained extensively masculine until the 1980s. So that's the vertical segregation, and then obviously the long-term impact of traditional conception of masculinity in banding culture, so male chauvinism, misogyny and sexism that can be found, and especially through interviews, recollection of the first women joining bands. And so it can go from jokes to derogatory comments or sexual assaults even sometimes, even if it's a bit more difficult to document. But definitely the strong the limits of this process, and the fact that the position of women in these bands was still constrained by these norms and values.
Again, this isn't a question that I wrote down, but sort of connecting it back to something you said about oral history and the way that it provides access to spaces that are otherwise inaccessible. I'm wondering, inside the broader question of how the people that you interviewed remembered this time, and specifically the sort of like experiences of the feminization of brass bands. I'm wondering if there were particular spaces that really stood out to you in the interviews, or that people really focused on, or that were really important to you in this process of understanding this shift.
I think all of the aspects related to the really day-to-day activities of bands are really interesting, because it's where we can see the weight of these gender norms. So everything related to the day-to-day organization of rehearsals, because that's when jokes or derogatory comments could be made, the way rehearsal could be organized, or even recently, I've got a few interviews who said that recently they had women who joined the band as conductor, and it was quite new, and that it was difficult for them to assert their power and to assert a discipline in the band with older men players sometimes, and things related to sometimes the consumption of drinking as well during rehearsals, and the fact that it seems to remain a ritual of sociability between men and between young men. So I've got one of the interviewees who told me, for instance, that when she was young, the band she played in had many women in them, and young teenagers and young girls, and that two old men regularly come to the rehearsals just to listen and to drink a beer, and they would offer beers to the young men in the boy teenagers in the band, but not to the women. Same with smoking. Things related to uniforms as well, and the way women were presented in some bands. For instance, I've had example of women telling me that, for instance, they couldn't wear pants as a uniform. They had to wear skirts.
There's one of the photographs in the article is amazing. I wrote it down here. It's the maybe I didn't write it down. I should have written it down, but it's the photograph. It's a later photograph, and all the men are wearing pink jackets, and all the women are sort of sitting in the front and wearing black. And I mean, maybe this is just a sort of an oversimplified analysis or whatever, but it was funny to me that all the men were wearing pink, and that all the women were wearing these incredibly reserved sort of outfits. And also in some of the other photographs that you included in the piece, it was interesting that there were a whole range of ages that were represented in these bands. And if there's anything there you'd like to comment on.
Yeah, I think it's a great picture too, and it's actually a cover from an LP that was recorded by one of the bands, and it's a very 70s style of outfit, I think, and this probably explains the pink, which is a bit strange now, but I think it's kind of interesting, but it's interesting because we can really see the difference in the cover between the women player and the men player, because they have distinct outfit, and I think it's a feature that really emerged with the fact that women became more and more numerous in bands, because I think when there was, from old photograph, when there was an odd one or two women in each band, sometimes they could wear the men's uniform because they didn't have enough, the band didn't have money or anything to have adapt and have funds to have uniforms for women players. So it's interesting that it's an hypothesis I have, but I think women's uniform emerged as a distinct feature along with important feminization of bands. And in terms of the age range, I think it's really showing how bands were an important vector of musical education in the coal fields, and how there was an internal way of educate both in the band through experienced players who would train the youngsters, and through family as well. So there's often several generations in one band, the grandfather, and then the father, and then the son, quite often, and it's also often emphasized by Coal News very much when there's all the family links in the band, because I think it's also a way to enhance that they are a family in the same way as the coal mining industry is a family, and a kind of a way to enhance a corporate image of the industry.
Okay, so maybe moving on to the connections that you make between this sort of shift and the impact of deindustrialization on feminization in brass bands.
Yeah, so I think it's an important aspect which explain why the 1960s are an important acceleration of the trend of feminization of brass band, because the 1960s in the coal mining industry in the UK is a period when employment in collieries declined, and when British coal mining areas were very impacted by deindustrialization, even if it's different depending on the areas. But from the late 1950s onwards until the 1990s, there were several phases of pit closure, and the 1960s were an important moment of pit closure, especially in the north of England and in Scotland. And during that period, we can see that because more and more coal mines close, it was difficult to find mining membership in bands anymore, and it was an opportunity for more and more women to join the bands. So it's definitely related, and I found several examples. So both through written archives and oral interviews in areas such as Scotland, for instance, that was very impacted by deindustrialization in the 1960s, that in these areas women progressed at the same time as pit were closing. But it needs to be related still to also the changing place of brass banding in popular culture, and the fact that there was also a disinterest for brass band in popular culture, which also made more space available for women. So it supports this idea that women could be a reserve army of labour to fill the seats in mining brass bands. And it also needs to be related to the development of musical education in schools, which made musical education more accessible for women too. So I think these factors need to be thought together, but deindustrialization mostly definitely was a factor. And then it's interesting because it raised the question that if brass bands became more and more feminized, we can ask ourselves if then it meant that it was it led to a loss of prestige, because it's an analysis that several sociologists make for several skilled sector of occupations, like engineers, for instance, saying that it becomes less and less prestigious if it's more and more feminized. So it's an interesting point as well.
Okay, so I mean, maybe moving towards the end of our conversation here. I mean, I've kept you for over an hour when I told you that it was going to be half an hour, so I hope that's okay.
That's okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I guess really this question is more about sort of the takeaway that you have, and this can be, you know, specifically related to the question of gender, which is what this article really addresses, but also as you've just defended your dissertation, you could you know, make this a little bit broader, but yeah, just in terms of thinking about your takeaways, and then also what you would hope people would take away from this piece.
Yes, so I think I want to stress that probably the complexity of analyzing gender relations and performance of masculinities in working class areas, because it's often, I mean, it's always the case in history, but it's often very ambiguous. And it's, I think, important to consider several factors, and it's what I wanted to do really, because often, so we have popular music studies focusing on the cultural aspects and the shifting place of popular music in society, and the shifting, the so-called decline of working class culture, but it's not necessarily tied to social economic factor and the impact of deindustrialization. So I think putting that together allows to see this complexity, and allows to revise and see in a new light the change in educations, for instance, and the evolution of music education, generational factors. And well, I think probably the main take would be that I think that leisure activities are a great port of entry, a point of entry into all of these processes, and I hope that it can encourage further research on these activities, because I think. And to come back on the gender aspect, we have a very, and it's been stressed by several historians who are part of the DePOT group, and especially Jackie Clark, for instance, who was leading with Arthur McIver the gender strand of the project. The fact that we have a very masculine representation of working class in our deindustrialized, post-industrialized society, and that in common representation, a worker is a white man, and I think this is linked to our perception of work and what working class, what work was supposed to be, but also what is perceived as working class culture. And I think it's important to deconstruct what working class culture was, as well as work-related activities, closures, etc., to see how we built this representation of the working class and of the working world, and to understand why, for instance, brass bands could be such a powerful symbol of British working class culture. So it's really this deconstruction aspect that I wanted to stress.
Wow, super interesting. And is there anything else that we maybe didn't touch on enough, or that you would like to elaborate more on from our conversation? Are there any gaps?
No, I think we've covered loads of grounds. But I'd be happy that if that the conversation can continue in further events, and that people maybe read the article and are interested enough to ask more questions. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And congratulations again.
Thank you.